You also heard in that piece an evocation of the blues. And blues is the close association of major and minor, probably evoking the situation from an African heritage of, in certain cultures, there's the notion of the blue third, the neutral third, which is neither a major do re mi or a minor do re mi, but some sort of in between da da. And you can sing that, and you can play it on a trombone, and you can play it on a guitar with a bottleneck, and you can kind of smear around on a clarinet, but you can't play it on a piano. Oh, by the way, da 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 da. Are we happy? Are we sad? Totally ambiguous. That's a little piece by either Khachaturian or Kabalevsky, one of those early Russian 20th century composers whose last name starts with a K. But that's the blues. We're not totally sad, but we ain't happy either. And on the piano, the closest you can do is one after the other, a grace note, or together. And Scott Joplin does it right at the beginning of The Entertainer, where he's actually starting on the second degree on a re. And since we're climbing up, rather than spelling it E flat as may, it's D sharp as re. And so it becomes re, re, mi, do, mi, do, mi, do. The cover of The Entertainer, the original publication, it's a little bit racist, but it has a comedian. And it looks like he's telling a joke. And maybe that's the joke. And the response is full chords on the piano. I'm only going to play the melodic line because I don't have the sheet music with me. Maybe, or the talent these days. But we get this. So they get the joke. They kind of go back to their white bread self. We'll hear this in the original piano publication version, as found in the movie The Sting, which was in 1970, and it basically rediscovered the world. There had been movement going along these lines, but it rediscovered for the world the wonders of Scott Joplin's music, which had largely been forgotten. Matter of fact, he dies somewhere around that mistaken year that I evoked. He does a full-fledged opera, and you guessed it, it's another composer who does an opera at the end of his career. It's not totally successful, and he dies of a broken heart. But at any rate, we're also going to then, in The Sting, this gangster caper movie, we'll hear an orchestration by a movie composer named Marvin Hamlish, and he really evokes the heritage of ragtime, which supposedly or purportedly or definitely came out of marching band music, as we mentioned. And what would have been a typical kind of slimmed down orchestration of such a band? Well, you might have had a clarinet on the top as a soprano. You might have had an alto line as a trumpet, and maybe then a tenor line, going down, I better not do that, as a trombone. And they would have been, and in jazz bands they're called the horns, and then a bass line played by initially a tuba if you're kind of coming out of that marching band tradition. But once you settle down, that will be played by string bass, which is considerably less mobile, unless you're the Philadelphia Mummers Parade, where they strap the string basses on their backs and march down the street. But even before that, usually in the score, you'll have some more harmony from, in this case, the banjo, which will evolve towards the guitar, the banjo having a resonator of a snare drum, actually, and their African roots. Piano will be in the mix, and that definitely means we are stable. I remember back where I used to teach at Marin Academy, sometimes we'd roll an upright piano from our rehearsal room down a hill rather hazardously, while somebody usually played ragtime to the concerts. And then finally, a drummer. And this drummer will be the heritage of the percussionists who are playing in the marching band. But even in the Mahler First Symphony, Third Movement dirge, the second, the little B section in the A dirge, which wasn't played on this series of discussions, but lectures, let's face it, that's what they are, but is in the whole recording. and the whole composition. And there's an evocation of marching band music, and you hear boom ching, boom ching, boom ching, and you see on the page that the snare drum is notated on the same staff as the bass drum. And that really comes from the marching band tradition, where not strapping on a bass, but a bass drum, played by the performer with a right hand. And then attached on the top of the bass drum would be two cymbals. And you would, is that right? No, just one cymbal. And you would, with your hand, take a mallet and you smash down. Oh, no, maybe another cymbal. Yeah, smash down with the other cymbal. So you got boom, ching, going back and forth. Well, that's a good idea when you're marching, but if you're sitting down, you could have considerably more. So how about put a snare drum in your lap, and then two tom-toms above, and maybe a floor tom, a tenor drum, and then how about a couple of cymbals up top, traditionally a splash cymbal, crash cymbal, and a ride cymbal, so you can do some repeated rhythms. And then you've got 2 feet. How about the organ tradition of using those feet? And this is going to be a little problematic, but let's try. Woo! 1 foot used against a pedal bass drum. These days, a lot of times called a kick drum. And then the other, extremely clever. And that would be that. Oh, that was just my knee. There's the foot. And that would be that. It's kind of an automatic version of that slapping one cymbal down on the other, but now with a foot pedal. 2 cymbals arrayed such that when you depress the foot pedal, the 2 cymbals slap together, known as a hi-hat, and that's also done in rhythms. Here it is from the Maple. No, the Entertainer. A pandemic sweeping the world. Deaths potentially from 17 to 50 million, perhaps as many as 100 million. That would have been the Spanish flu that raged through the world between 1918 and 1920. Hardly anybody talks about it anymore. We know World War I, the Roaring Twenties, and the Spanish flu actually started at the end of World War I. And Western powers didn't want to acknowledge it. Sound familiar? Spain, not being part of the Allies, it was a neutral country. They could cover that very well. So hence the name. Up before World War I and the flu, a feeling of business as usual, a positive atmosphere, and you find that really in the music of Scriabin. It's a world that's complacent enough that we can be experimental. And Scriabin's music is at the forefront of harmonic adventures. Another musical specialist. He does keyboard music, solo piano, and 5 symphonies. And this is an example of his last. Great admirer of Chopin, but maybe turning Chopin on edge. Is in Paris for a while, but by the time he does this symphony, he's moved back to Russia. It is scored for a very large orchestra, including a color organ. Evidently, Scriabin had synesthesia. He saw color as he heard sounds. Different composers have had that and come up with different images. The color organ is really the ancestor of the light show, and we'll just hear just a little bit of the opening of this. Beyond that, a composer who lives during the high times of the early 20th century and then into all the traumas of the mid, and really his career spans the first half of the 20th century, and that would be Ralph Vaughan Williams, or Ralph Vaughan Williams, as I grew up saying as an American. Many musicologists would look at me with my 6 selections of early 20th century music and say, Mark, why Vaughan Williams? Well, one of the greatest symphonists of the 20th century, highly respected in Great Britain, and a wonderful composer who goes through a lot of stylistic shifts, although he does maybe default to a mellowness, which we'll only hear partially in these examples. The earliest being an Aristophanic suite, that would be after the play of Aristophanes, incidental music for the wasps, and you hear some onomatopoeic music. That would be the buzzing of the bee-like creatures in the beginning with half steps, and then an English folk tune, somewhat distorted. Oh, and he is someone who is reviving English folk music, and he's also looking back to the great British composers, English composers of the Renaissance, and he does a little bit of finishing school in France. He actually studies with a slightly younger composer. That would be Maurice Ravel. Ravel says to him upon, this is the story at least, upon Vaughan Williams arriving at the studio, Écrivez-moi une petite minuet en la style de Mozart. Write me a little minuet in the style of Mozart. And supposedly the answer from Vaughan Williams, listen, pal, if I wanted écrivez une petite minuet en la style de Mozart, I wouldn't be here. Later, Ravel acknowledged that Vaughan Williams was the only one of his pupils who didn't sound like him, i.e. Ravel. But this first theme of this kind of a sonata allegro overture does manifest pretty much the whole tone scale to begin with. We're in F, and this little folk songy going awry. Do, re, mi, re, do, te, le, te, do. You have your cake and eat it. It's major on the way up and minor on the way down. Eventually there's a so, do, so, do, and it actually breaks the pattern, but quite wonderful. That's in 1909. Our next piece will be after World War I and after the Spanish flu, and this is 1921, and it should be the Roaring Twenties, but this is sort of the sobering 20s, evoking English Renaissance Catholic music by William Byrd. And so this is the Mass in G minor for double choir. We'll hear the opening Kyrie, an 8-part vocal counterpoint, just the initial Kyrie 1, followed by a little snippet of the ensuing Christe.